Hey everyone, welcome to The Explainer. Today we are unpacking one of the most sweeping pieces of legislation in modern American history. It's officially called Public Law 119-21, but you probably know it better as the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, or simply the OBBBA. This is a massive single piece of legislation, and it literally touches almost every single aspect of the American economy. To make sense of its sheer scope, we're going to look at this bill like a giant national balance sheet. We'll walk through the gives, the takes, and the builds to understand exactly how this law structurally rewires the federal budget. All right, let's dive right in.
Here is our roadmap for today. First, passing the big, beautiful bill. Then, taxes and Trump accounts. Third, changes to the safety net. Fourth, energy, defense, and borders. And finally, number 5, the economic bottom line.
All right, Section 1, passing the big, beautiful bill, and exactly how the OBBB came law.
So this bill moved with absolute sheer velocity. It was introduced in the House by Texas Representative Jody Arrington on May 20th, 2025, and it navigated through both chambers in just over a month. It actually landed on the president's desk and was signed into law on July 4th, 2025. Now, you know as well as I do, passing a bill of this magnitude so rapidly is highly, highly unusual in modern politics. So how on earth did they do it?
Well, they pulled it off through a process called budget reconciliation. Basically, this is a special legislative loophole that bypasses the standard 60-vote requirement you usually need to overcome a Senate filibuster. By using this tool, lawmakers only needed a simple majority, and they got exactly that. The bill barely squeezed through the Senate with a razor-thin 51-50 margin. Vice President J.D. Vance actually had to step in to cast the tie-breaking vote, since the bill faced universal Democratic opposition in both chambers.
Moving on to Section 2, Taxes and Trump Accounts. Let's look at the Give column of the OBBA.
Okay, so a completely new vehicle introduced in this bill is what's being called the Trump account. Here's how it works. Anyone can contribute up to $5,000 a year to a child's account, and those investment earnings are completely tax-deferred. But here's the really interesting part. The federal government will actually deposit $1,000 of seed money into these accounts for every U.S. citizen child born between 2025 and 2028. Now, to make sure people are participating in the market, the funds inside these accounts have to be invested in mutual funds or ETFs that track the S&P 500 or another major U.S. stock index. Then, once that child turns 18, the whole thing rolls over into a traditional IRA.
Now, the legislation also makes the 2017 individual tax cuts permanent, but it brings in these heavily discussed new tax deductions for tips and overtime pay. Which brings us to a pretty vital question. Does every single tip and hour of overtime you work count for these new tax deductions? The short answer, no. Definitely not. There are some incredibly strict guardrails in place.
Basically, qualifying for these deductions requires checking a very specific set of boxes. If you work in the service industry, checking these exact boxes is literally the only way you'll see this benefit. Let's look at the tip deduction. It's capped at $25,000 a year for workers making under $150,000, and the payment must be entirely voluntary. That means mandatory service charges or those automatic gratuities on large parties? Yeah, those don't count. On top of that, the worker has to be employed in one of exactly 68 specified job types. It's a similar story with the new overtime deduction. That one is capped at $12,500, and it only applies to extra halftime pay required by the federal Fair Labor Standards Act. So if your boss pays you overtime voluntarily, or if it's based solely on state laws, it doesn't qualify.
You know, the bill is just packed with these incredibly specific tax carve-outs, and it really creates some stark contrasts. For example, let's look at these two. On one side, we have a pretty broad deduction. Everyday individuals can now deduct up to $10,000 a year in auto loan interest. But there's a catch. It only applies to new cars that had their final assembly right here in the United States. Then, on the other side, we have a highly, highly niche break. Get this. The tax deduction for whaling boat captains has been massively increased. The maximum deduction for whaling hunting expenses was bumped all the way from $10,000 up to $50,000.
All right, Section 3, changes to the safety net. Let's look at the take side of the OBBA.
$1.2 trillion. That is a massive number. It represents the total reduction in federal spending over 10 years that's mandated by this legislation. The vast majority of this $1.2 trillion in reductions is driven by some really significant funding cuts and structural changes to low-income health insurance programs, specifically Medicaid, as well as nutrition assistance, what used to be called food stamps and is known today as SNAP.
So let's break down exactly how they are achieving those savings. For the first time ever, Medicaid will now include work requirements.
Recipients between the ages of 19 and 64 have to work, volunteer, or go to school for at least 80 hours a month to keep their coverage. SNAP benefits are seeing a similar shift, with work requirements expanding to include adults all the way up to age 64. Furthermore, green card holders now face a mandatory 5-year waiting period before they can even apply for Medicaid. The bill also shifts a huge administrative burden over to the states. Moving forward, states have to cover 75% of SNAP administrative costs, which is a big jump up from the previous 50%.
The takes apply to green energy too. The bill aggressively phases out the tax credits that were established back in the Biden-era Inflation Reduction Act. Those incentives for buying electric vehicles, installing solar panels, or building EV charging stations, they are set to expire largely between 2025 and 2027. And right in tandem with pulling back those green energy incentives, the law requires the federal government to lease at least 50% of requested public lands to private companies for oil drilling, mining, or logging. Plus, it actually reduces the royalties those petroleum companies are required to pay.
Okay, Section 4, Energy, Defense, and Borders. This is the build column of the OBB.
So the legislation injects a massive $150 billion in new defense spending. This includes $29 billion for shipbuilding alone and another $16 billion specifically dedicated to military innovation and artificial intelligence. We're talking about funding for next-gen tools like kamikaze drones and underwater drone boats. And notably, there's a massive $25 billion line item in there dedicated entirely to building a proposed Golden Dome missile defense system. But defense isn't the only area seeing a surge. Under the OBBA, funding for Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, is going to skyrocket from $10 billion to over $100 billion by the year 2029. To put that into perspective, this historic funding shift officially makes ICE the single most heavily funded law enforcement agency in the entire federal government. So where exactly is all that border security funding going? Well, $46.5 billion is earmarked to continue building a physical wall on the U.S.-Mexico border. Another $45 billion is dedicated over the next 4 years to add 100,000 new migrant detention beds. Just to give you a sense of scale, that represents a 365% increase in ICE's detention budget. Finally, roughly $29.9 billion is allocated to hire 10,000 new ICE officers to facilitate transportation and deportations. Ultimately, the overarching goal, stated right there in the legislation, is to create the capacity to deport up to 1 million people each and every year. Which brings us to our final section, Section 5, the economic bottom line. What does this all mean for the future?
We've looked at the gives, we've looked at the takes, and we've covered the builds. Now it's time to zoom all the way out and look at the macroscopic impact of this legislation, at least as projected by the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office. $2.8 trillion. That's trillion with a T. Despite that $1.2 trillion in cuts to the safety net we talked about, the CBO projects that, largely because they permanently extended those tax cuts, this legislation will actually increase the national budget deficit by $2.8 trillion by the year 2034.
The CBO also gave us some estimates on how this will impact income distribution over the next decade. By 2034, the top 10% of earners in the country are projected to see their incomes rise by about 2.7%, and that's primarily driven by the extended tax cuts. Conversely, the bottom 10% of earners are projected to see their incomes actually fall by 3.1%. That drop is an impact driven primarily by those sweeping cuts to Medicaid and food aid programs. Furthermore, as a direct result of the new restrictions, the work requirements, and the funding rollbacks to Medicaid, the CBO estimates that roughly 10.9 million Americans will lose their health insurance coverage entirely. And it's really worth noting here, it was this exact dispute, the fight over these specific health and welfare spending cuts, that actually contributed to a shutdown of the United States federal government back in 2025. Which leaves us with this final, overarching question. We have just seen a massive reallocation of federal priorities, a sharp pivot away from domestic welfare and green energy, and a massive push toward tax reductions, military defense, and strict border enforcement. So how will these sweeping, historic shifts in our national balance sheet reshape the American landscape leading up to 2034? It's an incredibly complex question, but the data we've covered today is going to be your foundation for understanding the years to come. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking questions, and I'll see you next time.